when you have a technology that took things that were complicated and expensive and makes them simple and affordable, it's a very clear sign that there's going to be a lot of disruptive change. Now, the question for those who are in the business of thought is that good or is that bad? In my view, as always, it comes down to the choices people make. The challenge you have is now all of a sudden, anyone's a thought leader.
Scott Anthony was the key part of the entourage that formed around the late great Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. For the last 22 years, Scott has worked at or been attached to a strategy consulting firm called Innosight. Scott is also the author of 9 books, including his latest one called Epic Disruptions: 11 Innovations That Shaped Our World. In this Everything Thought Leadership interview, I asked Scott to share the biggest learnings from his latest book, in which he talks about disruptions that long preceded the ones that Clay Christensen wrote about in the 1990s. I also asked Scott how he conducts his research and how he develops insights and writes them up. Finally, I asked Scott about the disruptive innovations he sees ahead in this thought leadership profession.
Hey, Scott, welcome to Everything Thought Leadership. Wonderful.
Bob, it is my pleasure to be here.
I want to talk largely about your book, which you might be able to notice I've been reading here. I'm mostly through it, and I think it's great. Your book focuses on historical disruptive innovations that, except for one, I guess, the iPhone, long preceded the ones that Clayton wrote about. Why did you decide to focus on these now?
So a couple things that I would say. First, why a history book in general? I have to admit, the idea of doing a history book was not mine. I actually had a different book that I proposed to my publisher. It was based on a class that I teach at Tuck called Leading Disruptive Change. It's about how do you lead through all the uncertainty we're facing today. The publisher said, that's interesting. However, we have a different idea for you. They had just named disruptive innovation one of 4 ideas that changed the world of business, along with emotional intelligence, shareholder value, and scientific management. They said, you have been in this field for 25 years. Who better to go and interrogate the idea through history? And at first, Bob, I said, no, that's not the book I want to write. But I sat with it and I said, for as much as I've thought about the idea of disruption, this is a lens I have never taken. And Clay Christensen always taught, you take an old problem, you look at it through new lenses, you're going to see something different. So I said, why not do it? I'm very thankful I did because I learned a lot. So that's part one. Part two, why these 11? Why pick Gunpowder and Julia Child and the one that you mentioned? So part of this is I was looking for things that met a definition that Sir Francis Bacon laid out in 1620 in Novum Organum, where he said there have been 3 things in world history that changed the state and appearance of the entire world. The world's different before and after. 2 of the 3 that Bacon mentioned are in the book, the printing press and gunpowder. The compass isn't because the history is too amorphous. So I'm looking for those things where literally you can see the difference between those 2. And I'm also trying to tell a good story. So Julia Child had her impact in the world. It doesn't quite rise up to the level of the printing press. I'm not going to argue with that, but it's a really good story. And through a good story, we can see things we would otherwise miss. And that's the biggest thing I take from all of this. History is a lens. History can teach us things. It may not repeat as the saying goes, but it certainly rhymes. And as we deal with all of these things today that feel like they will change the state and appearance of the entire world, well, the past can help show us things we would otherwise miss.
Yeah. So were there any perceptions you had before you did your research for the book? Any perceptions you had that you learned later after writing the book? Boy, I was completely wrong about this aspect of disruptive innovation.
There's 2 things I would highlight here. The first is kind of a obvious sort of thing. But, if you look at the previous books I've written, the previous books have as the subject in sentences companies generally. So it says Procter & Gamble did this. And the obvious thing is Procter & Gamble doesn't do anything. Procter & Gamble is an organization who does something, well, people do something. So this idea that it really is individuals that are then working in teams, that are then in departments, that are then working together, that's what makes innovation happen. So I have a story in the book about Pampers. It's not Procter & Gamble that does Pampers. It's Vic Mills tapped on the shoulder to explore new areas, asking Bob Duncan to go into the diaper category, getting a team with Henry Tecklenburg and others, and then all the main blah, 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 blah. The stories have heroes, and those heroes, that's a plural word, not a singular word. It's kind of obvious, but still, really doing the historical research brought that into relief. The second thing, I'm a believer. I believe in the power of disruption. I believe it makes the world a better place. I believe it drives progress. The research showed me very clearly that while that is true, disruption also casts a shadow. And part of that shadow we get intuitively when a disruptive innovation changes dynamics in a market. There are winners and there are losers, but it's deeper than that. When a big disruptive change happens, like Henry Ford's Model T, society has to deal with change. In the 1920s, there's chaos and carnage on the streets of cities because they were built not for cars, but for people and for horses. And it takes time to go through that. And individually, we all suffer from the status quo bias. We would like things, all else being equal, to stay exactly the same. And when something like ChatGPT shows up in your hand and you're a teacher or you're a parent, you all of a sudden have this new thing to deal with, and it's really hard. So that shadow is something that was drawn into very sharp contrast through the research and writing. Those are the two things I learned.
Yeah. Your first point, I remember people say, well, Ross Perot he was kind of the pioneer of outsourcing when he set up EDS. Well, no. Ross Perot was working at IBM and he tried to sell IBM on outsourcing. And so I guess he didn't get very far. And so he left and he founded EDS. Same thing with the founder of Paychex, the payroll service. Tom Golisano tried to sell a mid-market payroll service firm on providing payroll services for small businesses. Everybody, including ADP, were focused on large and mid-sized business. So Tom couldn't convince management of the payroll processing company he worked for, we ought to go after the shoe store or and so he left and he did it. So to your point of it's individuals. Sometimes they work in big companies. Sometimes those big companies don't listen to them and they leave and they create an innovation that changes a lot of things.
And historically, I mean, your stories are great because historically, the big companies wouldn't listen, particularly if it was something that was a true disruption that took things that were complicated and expensive and made them simple and affordable, reaching new market segments, changing dynamics, driving explosive growth. Clay Christensen's research showed very clearly that the large established organization would discount and underinvest in these things, so people would have to eject out and do it. Now, the thing that has really changed is large organizations now understand the phenomena. They don't always manage it perfectly, but you go back 20 years ago, Microsoft would have been dead. It would not have gotten the cloud. It would not have gotten AI. Facebook would not have acquired WhatsApp. It would not have acquired Instagram. Those would be big companies that blah, 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 blah. So sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, the large companies are figuring this out. It's a lot different. Not easy, still very challenging, but it is materially different now.
Yeah. Entrepreneurship, I guess, has thrived in some places. A brother of mine was chief marketing officer at Nestle for many years until about 3 years ago. And he used to tell me about the Nespresso, which has been a huge hit. And that's a coffee machine created by whatever Nestle was at the time, an $80 billion a year, multinational company. That's an example of entrepreneurship that has thrived. We typically hear, I think, of the failures of entrepreneurship or the entrepreneur who had to leave in order to, launch the big business. So looking at your book, what do you think were the biggest lessons? What are the biggest lessons and who needs to heed them the most?
Well, I will say, bias of an author, I think everybody needs to heed them. But, I think in particular, if you're leading a large enterprise, you need to pay attention to the lessons of history about disruption. If you are tapped on the shoulder and asked to go and create something anywhere, you need to heed these lessons. And I would argue that if you're living life in 2025, 26, you need to heed these lessons because we're in a world where disruption is just coming fast and furious. So here they are, three primary lessons. Number one, disruption changes the world for better and sometimes for worse. We have to understand that when a disruption like artificial intelligence or robotics or some of the new things emerging in healthcare, as they play out, the world will look materially different. There will be good things. There will be bad things. Number two, disruption isn't done by superheroes. Julia Child, as an example, is something we've talked about. She wasn't born a great chef. The first time that she took the final exam at Le Cordon Bleu, she failed it. The first meal that she made for her husband, Paul Child, was brain simmered in red wine sauce. Why she picked that, who knows? But it was a disaster. She learned, she experimented, she was curious, she persevered. Innovation, great innovators are not superheroes. They follow these kinds of behaviors. They're curious, they're collaborative, they experiment, and so on. And number three, innovation, it rewards people who are patient and perseverance. You have to learn how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. There are no overnight success stories. The last chapter in the book is the Apple iPhone. I sometimes will ask groups, how old is the iPhone? And people are like, well, it launched in 2007, so that makes it about 20. I say, wind back. They say, well, people were probably working on it for a couple years. Wind back. You can talk about Apple's failed effort with the Apple Newton in the mid 1990s. Wind back. You can go to the 1950s, where a failed science experiment done by Corning ultimately, 55 years later, led to the Gorilla Glass on the iPhone screen. So it's not overnight successes. You have to be, in Jeff Bezos's words, willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time and learn how to be comfortable with the discomfort that comes with that.
Yeah. And some of these innovations, like Ray Kroc's, came later in his life. He was in his 50s when he saw what the McDonald brothers were doing in San Bernardino, all the people who were lining up outside their burger chain, their fast food, and said, something's going on here. As you said in your book, Ray was selling milkshake machines, wasn't he?
That's exactly right. And the reason I'm smiling is, things that are in plain sight that you miss. So I was talking to the PR company that helped me with the book launch, and they're trying to think about story angles. And they said, well, what about going after AARP? Because the people who are members actually are very avid book readers. I said, well, I just turned 50 this year, so I'm now an AARP member. And they said, are there any stories in the book with people older than 50? I'm like, probably, but I hadn't thought about it. And then every single chapter. It's not that Ray Kroc is an anomaly because he's the plus 50 or 52, whatever, when the stories start, protagonist. Every chapter has a critical role. Even the printing press in Gutenberg. When the Gutenberg Bible came out, he was 54 years old. And this is in the 15th century. So, and I think there's something interesting in that. If you study intelligence, there are two types. There's fluid intelligence, how quickly we learn things, etc. And there's crystal intelligence, which essentially is accumulated wisdom. Fluid goes down over time. It peaks around 20 and begins to decline. But crystal intelligence goes up for a very long period of time. And you could argue that the crystal intelligence that someone like Ray Kroc has, who had been around the block, who had seen many things, who knew a good idea when he saw it, that's really important for innovation. Maybe this is a self-serving argument now that I've turned 50, but I think disruption begins at 50.
Don't you wonder, though, if Ray had walked into Kleiner Perkins or anybody on Sand Hill Road at age 50, you think they would have listened to his pitch?
No way, I think. You never say absolutes, but I think the only hope Ray would have had is if he found some kind of 19-year-old to go with him. And Ray would be the kind of guy in the corner, and the 19-year-old would be the puppet in this case that was pitching the story. Because look, there's a clear bias among venture capitalists that disruption comes from the youth. And the bias is not fully supported by data. Of course, lots of great things have been done by young people. There is data to suggest that. But there's a role to play for wisdom and intelligence and accumulated experience as well. And one of the things I really wonder about that we will never know, I talk in the book about how Kodak was this close to being the leader in social media because it bought Photo, the photo sharing site, in 2000, 4 years before Mark Zuckerberg and team begin to code. And you just do the thought experiment. What would happen if a company that was run by smart, thoughtful people that would carefully consider upsides and downsides to the approaches that they followed actually owned social media? Would the world that we live in now that is drowning in disinformation and polarization, would it be a different world? You can't argue the counterfactual, but I think maybe it would actually be a better world. Who knows?
I agree with that 100%. 100%. So let's talk about how you did the research. Was it Kevin Evert at HBR Press and HBR who said, hey, Scott, we like your idea. We have another idea. When he said that, how did you then go embark on the research?
I just started reading a bunch, so I first started actually looking at the Innovators solution, Clay's second book, along with Michael Rayner as his co-author. And in the first chapter, there was an appendix that said, over the past 100 years, here are a bunch of disruptive innovations. I said, okay, Henry Ford Model T, that looks pretty good. McDonald's, that looks pretty good. There's Steel Mini Mills, which is a classic. You got to include that if you've got a book on Clay Christensen. So I had those three. I thought the iPhone would be a good ending story. I had four. And then I'm like, Kevin suggested gunpowder, and the printing press is like, well, the printing press seems like something you got to have. So I had a backbone of six, and I just got a bunch of books that talked about the history of each of these things and started reading. And as I started doing that, ideas for other things came in, like, oh, this idea that I saw in one book that I read, that innovation as a word has gone through lots of changes in its meaning. So in the 16th century, it was a derogatory word as opposed to a positive word. Said, well, let's talk about what allowed that word to be reclaimed. Scientific revolution. That's a disruptive idea. Let's add that on. Anyway, you start doing it, you get more ideas there, but it really is just a lot of reading and try to then sense make around it. Then in December of 2023, very pivotal moment, I had done enough where I was about ready to start writing, but my soul was not ready to start writing. So what I tried to do, I had this random webinar that came up with a company. I said, I'm going to use this to do a low resolution prototype of the book. I'm just going to say, I know enough to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about any of the stories in the book. I'm going to try and use it as a way to teach general innovation principles. It might not work, but I'll learn something in the process. And that was a way to help me begin to see, all right, these are foreground, these are background, these are things I want to highlight, these are things I don't want to highlight, etc. So that was the basic approach I followed. Read, then talk, then write. Read, talk, write. Read, talk, write. Repeat, repeat, repeat.
Was there any aspect of that was more difficult for you than others? Is the writing the hardest part, or is it the thinking, what am I going to say? What is the narrative? What's the argument I'm trying to make?
It's a great question. I'm looking to the ceiling, hoping that the heavens provide me an answer. This is the way I think about it. My daughter is 17, is taking a creative writing class at her high school, and she's reading the book On Writing by Stephen King, which I was excited she's reading because I read that book and really liked it. And the way Stephen King described his writing process is he said, version 1 with the door closed, version 2 with the door open. So door closed, you're with yourself and your words, and you're trying to come up with something, and you do the best you can, and then you open the door and begin to get lots of feedback. Getting version 1 done is never a super hard thing for me. I might not be the best writer, but I'm a pretty quick writer. Obviously not as fast as ChatGPT, but whatever. This was 100% written by humans. So, version 1, but then trying to figure out what's really going to make it a great book, that's hard. And, so you open the door for version 2, and Harvard gives input, friends give input, you're talking about it with people, I'm sharing stories with my kids and saying, how do I say two people who've given completely contradictory feedback, who do I listen to, et cetera? That is just, there's no formula for that. That's just trying a bunch of things out and continuing to push until you get it right. I remember just one example of this. I had lunch with Melinda Marino, who is Kevin's boss at Harvard Business Review Press, and she said something that I just didn't anticipate. The first version of the book, I called it Magic Methods and a Bit of Madness, How Disruptive Innovators Change the World. And she said, I like the idea, but the methods part, just take it out. Because I tried to cram in tools, frameworks, checklists. She said, you've done that before. You've got books, people could find it. I want the stories. I just want the stories because they're so rich and interesting. A little bit of light takeaways, but this is not meant to be a tool book. Take them out. And, Harvard does tool books and framework books. So to have the top editor say that, I said, didn't see that one coming, but I listened to her. And again, I'm glad I did.
Let's look at disruptive innovation and this profession that I and others call thought leadership. And, the profession, including people like you who are well recognized for ideas, but it also includes the people who help people like you bring your ideas to market. And they could be ghostwriters, editors, data visualization people, presentation coaches, events organizers. There's a woman in Europe who's a specialist in marketing events, thought leadership marketing events. And she writes passionately about how this growing field of running a marketing event, with thought leaders speaking, is kind of become a discipline. So do you think disruptive innovation, especially things like generative AI, are going to change this profession of thought leadership that both you and I have been part of for a few decades?
I think the short answer is absolutely. And the longer answer. So, I had a first career about 25 years as a management consultant and learned a lot, liked it a lot. But also, management consulting is a very fatiguing profession. Every day you're fighting a battle against something. It might be the project, it might be the client, it might be the world, it might be your own team every day. So, then in 2022, I say, this has been fun. I'm going to make a career pivot. I'm going to go from consulting to teaching because being in an academic institution doesn't change that much. It's nice and slow moving. Not that much happens. I joined the faculty July of 2022. 4 months later, ChatGPT comes out and boom, there we are. We are right in the maelstrom of a disruptive change. Then echo from education out to thought leadership. And when you have a technology that took things that were complicated and expensive and makes them simple and affordable, it's a very clear sign that there's going to be a lot of disruptive change. Now, the question for those who are in the business of thought is that good or is that bad? In my view, as always, it comes down to the choices people make. The challenge you have is now all of a sudden, anyone's a thought leader because anyone can use ChatGPT or can use Claude or whatever to come up with things that look really good and are slick. Now, whether they have depth or it is, internet slop or whatever, reasonable people can disagree. But you have many more people who are able to do things. You also have the ability to slice, dice, and recreate content in new ways. I was talking to the Speakers Bureau that represents me, and they said, we're going to do different language versions of you so that you can speak in Portuguese and Russian, whatever language you want to speak in. And so you have this ability now to do some really different things. I think that means all of us have to do what you have to do when disruption happens. You have to keep learning. You have to keep experimenting. You have to keep playing. And what exactly the world will look like on the other side, no way of knowing that. But I know fortune favors those who go and dive right in and go and play along with it. But I think there's no doubt you're going to see big changes in the space of everything related to the creation, distribution, packaging, et cetera, of thought leadership. My net view in all of these things always is optimism because history shows disruption makes things more widely accessible, allows people to reach broader audiences, creates powerful growth. The winners and losers are to be determined, though.
What about the consulting industry itself? Let's put thought leadership to the side. The business of advising companies, of being brought in, sizing up a situation with a team or an individual and telling a company you need to do this or you need to do that or you need to stop doing this. What about the profession of consulting and generative AI, AI's impact?
Now we get to the fun part. So I started teaching a class a couple years ago called Gen AI and Consultative Decision Making. It's a mouthful, but half of our graduates go into consulting. So I said, let's create a sandbox where we can be consultants now fully armed with AI and see what happens. Where I left the first version of that class is if I were in the business of doing what I would call arm waving consulting, where you're like, yeah, I know enough to give you some advice, but I don't have super rich data, blah, blah, blah. There's no way I would create a business that looked like a pyramid today. I would create a business that was an inverse pyramid where I got a bunch of experts and somebody who's really good at getting quick insight using AI to make you sound pretty smart. That's one type of consulting, arm waving consulting. The type of work where you've got to align a group behind something and deal with very intricate processes that are complex and individualistic to a specific corporate market, that is business that I think exists forever because I think it's really hard and intricate and hard to turn over to technology. But I think there are big portions of the advice giving world that are going to change in very material ways. And I think I kind of wonder about is, will McKinsey and Accenture be the equivalent of the Catholic Church in the 15th century? What do I mean by that? If you go back to Gutenberg and his printing press, the first customer of any scale, not surprisingly, is the church. It's got real problems to solve. It wants to standardize service. It wants to make sure Bibles don't take 3 years to produce. So at first, the printing press looks awesome because it can do this much faster. Then as people like Martin Luther use the same technology to say, hey, the dominant doctrine need not be the only doctrine, and the church splinters, they're not feeling so great about spurring and sponsoring the technology. So right now, it is boom time for the big consulting companies because they're helping people implement, they're helping people change decision-making and so on. but what genie are they letting out of the bottle? Does the client get sophisticated enough that it doesn't need to hire a consultant? Do they obviate a lot of their work by helping clients develop these skills? Again, no one knows for sure, but history says it's at least a question worth asking.
Are you in touch with a lot of ex-clients of yours at Innosight? And if so, have they told you, I was thinking of using McKinsey or Bain or Accenture or Innosight, but we just typed into ChatGPT our big question, our strategic question, and out came a pretty useful output, and we decided maybe we don't need one of these firms. Have you heard anything to that extent?
Yeah, I've heard everything leading up to. So people will say, and you talk to, real people, operators, people who are in organizations as opposed to consultants. A lot of we are experimenting with, and there are circumstances where it looks like we're getting output that's pretty commensurate with big consulting companies. And yet we're still hiring them because the job to be done isn't always the answer. Sometimes the job to be done is I need a third party to give me that answer. Or sometimes the job to be done is I need my board to listen when the person says the answer. Or the job to be done is I got to really get my group aligned behind something. And it's hard to do that inside. Sometimes you need an outsider to do it. So I would say you see some pretty clear signs, and the data supports this, of a lot of use, but not change in the purchasing yet. Again, I think that will change over time as the models get better, people figure out how to use them. Now, of course, the good thing for McKinsey, Accenture, BCG, Innosight, range of others, they've got tools that can allow them also to push further. And you go and take the data that you have internally, all the great client work you've done and so on, and you use tools in the right sort of way, you continue to push the frontier as well. So, my suspicion is this will not be an extinction event for the industry, but my suspicion is it will be a separation event where you will have those that really pick up the technology, use it, refashion their business and get stronger, and those that begin to really fall pretty far behind. And again, time will tell.
What will characterize the ones who fall behind? What will these firms not be doing or be doing that results in them trailing the
rigidity? I mean, it really comes back to rigidity and the metabolism of learning. So what is the degree to which they're continuing to learn and push the envelope? And, it's interesting. I was just with a big professional services company this week whose name I will not name because I don't want to get in trouble. But, the reframe that I tried to give them is they said, we're going to use technology to disrupt ourselves. I said, that's really hard. And you don't actually want to do that. You want to use technology to go and reach clients you couldn't reach, to go and compete differently against competitors. You want to disrupt the market. And if that leads to you disrupting yourself, great. But if you frame it internally from day one, that's going to feel incredibly threatening to your people. All sorts of defense mechanisms are going to kick in. You're going to get defensive and rigid. If you have it as something where it's an opportunity, you're expansive in how you approach it. Clark Gilbert, a long-term colleague and co-author of mine from Innosight, this was what he found in his doctoral research that went in the newspaper industry, which is a whole separate thing we could talk about. But the research, he said, the dilemma in response, you have to perceive the threat to allocate resources, but you have to view it as an opportunity to realize the potential. And that still is a finding that I don't think enough people have internalized. They get that they need to do something, but they're too defensive in their response. And that's what I think will separate the winners and losers. The ones who see the possibility, the opportunity, and they can adapt and view it as a good thing, not as a thing we have to do or something we do defensively.
So are you saying in part that if you approach it right, in this case, AI and consulting, you might see new opportunities that your consulting firm doesn't even think are opportunities? You think these clients can't afford us, they're too small or whatever, or we don't do that work. They can't afford us, but we don't do that work. Is that what you're getting at?
The example you shared of the payroll processor who said, how can we possibly serve a shoe business? You come up with the right business model, and all of a sudden, I cut my teeth at McKinsey. So I understand that business. I spent 20 plus years at Innosight. I understand that business. There's a finite set of customers because you gravitate towards serving people who are in very tall towers who have lots of money. And that works really well, but that's a minority of the businesses in the world. So you go and figure out a different model, the world's open to you. And you use a product example. When Apple launched the iPhone in 2007, it would have been easy for Apple to say, hey, we shouldn't do this. We've got a personal computer line that this could go and get, or I've got behind me. People now are, my students don't have any idea what this is when I hold it up, but you know, right? So this is the iPod that brought Apple back from the brink. The iPhone destroyed this business. But of course, Apple's very happy it destroyed that business because of all of the net growth that happened. This is what happens when you get disruption right. Changes the model, but drives explosive growth.
Yes. I got to tell you something funny about the Paychex example. So Paychex at that time was a multi-billion-dollar company, public, and its profit margins doing payroll services for small companies. I think average number of employees was like 12 or something like that. Its profit margins after tax were higher than Microsoft's. In 2002. It was 30% net after tax.
Wow, that's amazing.
Payroll for small businesses. And so he found a way, obviously, to meet that market in a very profitable way. So let's go back to the thought leadership profession. You worked with Clay early in his research at Harvard. If you're a thought leadership professional today, especially a researcher, you're working with the next Clay Christensen, or you're working at a consulting firm with a bunch of really smart people. What do you have? What does that person, that thought leadership researcher, have to keep in mind if he or she wants to keep their job and not be eliminated by generative AI doing work better?
So I'd say a couple things, and this comes straight out of the class that I taught, some of the reflections from it. So one of the key things to being a great consumer of AI is to have wisdom. And wisdom allows you to ask great questions. Wisdom allows you to separate when you get results, what is actual insight versus what is politely a hallucination and politely bullshit. So, wisdom helps you do that. Wisdom helps you then put something into context and connect it to other things. Where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from accumulated experience. Wisdom comes from struggling. Wisdom comes from learning. I show this to my students. I think it's kind of a fun little example. There's an interview with Jerry Seinfeld in the Harvard Business Review about a decade ago, talking about his show. And his show, he famously micromanaged every single detail. And the interviewer asked him, said, that led to a lot of burnout. Would it have been better if you hired someone like McKinsey to make it more efficient? And Seinfeld said, who's McKinsey? And the interviewer said, they're a consulting company. And Seinfeld said, are they funny? And the interviewer said, no, they're not funny. And McKinsey, again, having cut my teeth there, I can attest to that. And Seinfeld said, then there would be no use for them because the right way is the hard way. The goal is not to make it more efficient. We have to go through all of that to get to great output. So to the 22-year-old researcher, there would be temptation to say, let me just turn everything over to AI and I'm going to get great output. You will never develop the wisdom that enables you to truly be a great researcher and then thought leader if you do that. So the advice would be, yes, lean in, learn and use the tools and go through the struggle, because the struggle is how you learn where wisdom comes from. It's what allows you to really come up with breakthrough insights. The analogy I tell my students is you want to, develop your muscles, you go to the gym, you lift weights. You can bring a forklift there and lift any amount of weight that you want, but that's not the point. Your arms don't get stronger if you do that.
Roll up your sleeves. Get in the middle of this generative AI stuff.
For sure. And, it's the thing that I think is really cool about it is, I love dearly the colleagues that I work with at Innosight, and I miss them. However, with the tools I have now, I can do research like this that's really powerful and interesting. So as an example, I had a hypothesis. I wrote this book, Dual Transformation, 2017, about companies that had successfully transformed. The hypothesis was some companies that we identified in research had done great since then. Some companies hadn't, and there was a difference between the two populations. In the old days, I'd have a team of multiple people going and beating that up over months. In a day, I had a 70% answer to that question. Not 100%. How? This is I use both OpenAI, I use ChatGPT and Anthropic. I said, number one, I need to assemble a database of the 100 companies that are in this book and 3 research reports that Innosight issued. I need to go, first step, identify who has outperformed and who hasn't since then. So that's a little bit of light coding to be able to do that. And got, again, not perfect, but a good enough answer. And then I need patterns. I need to say the ones that made it, like Schneider Electric, DBS Bank, Microsoft, Relics are companies that have thrived. Adobe, Orsted, a few others are ones that have not. They hit it once and then they declined. What's different between them? And I said, here's some things that you might think about. And I had both things going simultaneously. I crossed the two streams over and said, critique the research you see out of here, and you come up with three answers. So one is CEO longevity really matters because longer term CEOs have the ability to continue to push. Number two, it really comes down a lot to culture, the ability to say, we're going to not have transformation be a one-shot deal, but be something that really is continual. And number three, sometimes in life, bad things happens and you can't control everything. So, Orsted had the downside of people looking at wind turbines and in some countries thinking it's a very bad thing. You can't do too much about that if you're a single product company. Diversification really, really helps. Is that perfect research? No, I haven't published it anywhere. I haven't sought to publish it anywhere. But is it enough that when I'm having a conversation with a business leader, I've got some good things in my back pocket to talk to them about? For sure. And again, that was a day of work.
Have you ever thought about if Clayton was starting his research now, if he was still here, and you were working for him, and you're starting to do the case research that led to the big idea, the impact of generative AI in doing that research? Have you ever thought about that?
One of the things that Clay would always say is a part of doing research when you're trying to really pioneer, push the frontier. It's anomaly seeking research. You're looking for the things that you don't expect, and you have to do what he called dumpster diving, which is just you got to go and sort through the trash and go and see where's the scrap that you can find. And for him, and this is before I was working with him, this is his original research. It's I am going to assemble a proprietary data set of every disk drive innovation that has ever existed by combing through Disk Trend magazine and going to do this. Now, had that been digital and had you had ChatGPT, you could have assembled that a lot faster. So, I think the dumpster diving could have been expedited with the technology tool. I think then being able to say, I'm going to look at this through the lens of Joe Bauer's research and Robert Bergelman's research on resource allocation and the Pfeffer Solonic research on resource dependency. I don't know what large language model will tell you to do that because no one had thought about that before. So that requires a human just having done all the work to say, there's something that doesn't fit in either of these. Let's take two very different lenses and look at it. I don't know. It's a great question, though.
You're saying he would have collected the dots faster, but he might not have connected the dots.
Yeah, I think that's very well put.
Right. Yeah. And I still wonder, I'm thinking people can connect the dots a lot faster through this technology.
And I think it's an interesting question. I probably like you, I follow Ethan Mollick and I love all of his writing about the wonders of AI. And, he talks frequently about how it's really pushing the ability to generate new knowledge. I have not seen anything that has come out from him that I say, that's an interesting new idea I haven't seen. So to me, it looks like it is improving the ability to develop papers faster, but it is not yet demonstrated that it leads to that dot connection where I say, a new insight that I hadn't seen before faster. We're in year 3. So, this is still pretty early days. And the thing that I tell students, I tell executives, again, the way that you stay on the frontier is by staying on the frontier. So don't be like, I tried that and it didn't work, so that's done. The technology is improving by the second. Keep pushing, keep playing, keep practicing, keep learning. My class that I'm teaching next term, I've got 2 new fun little AI tools that I built. They're not the world's greatest thing, but one lets you experience the innovator's dilemma through a very short game. One is a virtual Shark Tank or Dragon's Den where you can pick 9 different personas and it's programmed to give you feedback on an idea. Just fun ways to engage students in different forms of learning. So, that's what I do to try and stay current. And a lot of weeks I'm using AI a couple times a week and that's it. And then there's some weeks where that's my life. I'm living on it.
Last question. You retired early from consulting. You were less than 50, right? You're 50 now?
Correct.
Do you miss consulting?
No, I still get a chance to do it individually. It's more coaching than consulting now. But, I was thinking about this the other day. Somebody's saying, wasn't it really jarring to make the career switch that you did? I said, actually, not at all. Because, I, at my core, the way I describe myself is I'm a consummate optimist that is passionate about spreading ideas. And consulting is one way to do that, and teaching is another way to do it. And, I've had to learn some new skills, and my students will tell you I'm really good at some of them, but have lots of room for improvement in other ones. But at its core, it's ideas and playing with ideas and shaping ideas and sharing ideas. The thing I miss are my colleagues. I miss the time that I would spend with them. The thing I cherish is the new colleagues I have. And, academics are different than consultants, and for better or for worse. But I found it really fun and energizing to go onto a new S curve and learn a lot of new things all over again.
Are there any professors you admire? A Scott Galloway or an Adam Grant, superstar thought leaders, superstar professors who seem to have the best of both worlds. They're teaching, they're influencing the students in their class, but they're influencing the world.
Yeah, for sure. And beyond those, there is Linda Hill, who does great work at Harvard and great work externally. There's Wendy Smith, who teaches at Delaware and has done really pioneering work on how you think about paradoxes. And at our school, you've got Ron Adner, who has done cutting edge work on ecosystems, Emily Blanchard, who is an economist who makes the dismal profession sound like the most exciting thing in the world. And they also happen to be great teachers. One thing that I have had a regular habit of is whenever I'm in an active teaching cycle, I find at least one class where someone's won a teaching award, and I sit in and watch. And not the content. I don't care about the content. It's just how people carry themselves. There's a person on our faculty, Joseph Garakos, who teaches in accounting, and I was mesmerized by his ability to teach working capital. It's just, there is true art and true mastery that you get to see. And I just feel incredibly lucky. Tuck takes teaching very seriously. There are some amazing teachers there, and I get the privilege of learning from them.
Last question. What joys do you get from teaching that you perhaps didn't get from consulting?
The moment where you see a student's eyes light up and you realize that they see something that they did not otherwise see. So, that is just a moment that's really hard to replicate. Just the thought that in that moment, you have changed the way that their brains are wired. You're changing the way they're thinking, which will ultimately change the way they're acting. You get some of that in consulting, but not the immediacy. It's amazingly invigorating when you get it right. When you also get it wrong, and you've got 65 faces that are staring at you saying, what nonsense are you talking about here? That's great real-time feedback too, I guess.
Do you ever kind of stand in front of your class and just think to yourself or afterwards, some of these people may be starting billion-dollar, unicorns in the next 10 years, and I don't know who they are. I may know who they are. I may not know who they are, but they're learning a lot from me and other professors here at Dartmouth, and they're learning a lot on their own. They're going to go somewhere.
I'm in year 3 of this new profession. So it's too early for me to have the, 10, 15, 20 years come back and say, wow, look at what you've become. And I have my bets on people who've come through where I'd say, if you were a stock, I would buy your stock. But I'm sure I'm going to be wrong. And there's going to be some that I did not see at all that turn out to be true superstars. But I imagine, and I've heard from other faculty, that it's just amazingly rewarding when someone like that comes back and says, you might not know it, but you played a role in this. And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Any question I should have asked you that I didn't?
Oh, no, Bob, we have covered so much territory in our discussion. This has been a ton of fun. And I thank you very much for the time.
Yeah, likewise, Scott. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Boudet TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Boudet Thought Leadership Partners at boudettlp.com.